Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you all the way on the West Coast. I'm Avi Grossman, and this Parsha talk tonight, this afternoon, we're very happy to have Dr. Jeremy Brown. He's the editor of Talmudology, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and also the director of emergency care research at the National Institutes of Health. And let's say something about the Parsha. First of all, we're going to live the day after all that craziness in the Capitol. This week's Parsha, according to Ghazal, describes the beginning of the Egyptian servitude. And the Midrash says that it wasn't overnight that the Israelites were enslaved. Pharaoh actually had a plan to trick them into it. And like most other tragic events that happen in people's personal lives, and also on national level, socio-political unrest is usually the product of a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. And we have to keep this in mind. When things like this happen, it's not because it just happened suddenly. It's actually part of a process that began many years ago and is just currently unfolding in front of us. As always, we try to stay out of these things and try to find a deeper lesson in it. Dr. Brown, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Please tell us a little bit. What is your role at the National Institutes of Health?
Well, thanks, Avi, for having me on. It's a delight to chat with you in person. We've communicated a lot by email, but it's really a pleasure to see you and to speak to you in person. My role at the NIH, I direct an office called the Office of Emergency Care Research. By training, I'm an emergency physician, ER doctor. And this office helps to promote all kinds of research that affects patients in the emergency setting. So that's anything from patients at home who have collapsed in the field, as they're called, patients in the pre-hospital setting in the field, all the way through to the emergency department and very shortly afterwards. So in that little niche of time between the onset of some medical emergency and the beginning of definitive care, and that is the area that I'm focused on at the NIH. And I spend most of my days helping researchers with their proposals and sort of doing the administrative work of funding the proposals that are the best ones out there.
Do you also have a yeshiva background?
I do. I spent 2 very happy years at Yeshivat HaKotel. I was there from 1982 to 1983 in Yerushalayim Bein HaChomot in the old city of Jerusalem, and then I went back actually in the middle of medical school. From 1980, I think it was 85, 86. So I have 2 years at Yeshiva HaKotel, yeah.
Okay. So that explains it. But I saw that HaKotel, in my experience, had a very high percentage of non-Americans in the English speakers program. And even as recently as 4 years ago, when I was associated with HaKotel, I also saw it. I was quite surprised. There are a lot more. Some places are just...
Of course, things have changed a lot now. I mean, to think about my years in 1985, 1982, that's a whole lifetime away. That was a whole Israel away. I used to communicate with my parents with aerograms. Those were little blue letters that you would fold and mail and hope that they would get there 2 or 3 weeks later. So that's how we spoke. Of course, my kids spent time in Israel and spoke to us 3 times a day or more on FaceTime.
Okay. So tell me, how has the Corona situation affected your work?
Well, I've been spending the last, was it now 8-9 months in my office down here. So we were sent home very, very early on and still had no plans to go back. About 80% of the National Institutes of Health employees work like I do in areas that are not to do with patient care. And so we've been working from here, and we've pivoted very well, I think. Almost everything that we do in person can be done in this setting. And as I was explaining to some friends recently, we've now done this for so long that things that were at first different, like managing very large meetings that we have 2 or 3 times a year, we're now doing this for the 2nd or 3rd time. And so it's become just the way that things work. And look, there's a lot of downsides to this. There's the camaraderie, and I haven't gone to a medical meeting now in 10 months. But we're all hunkering down, waiting for the vaccine to get delivered here. You've probably all been vaccinated in Israel several times by now, but I know all my family has, and it's a wonderful thing. So we're waiting for that to happen here.
I was told today by a number of medical professionals and two rabbis also involved in medicine get vaccinated as soon as possible. But unfortunately here, I can't just go and do that. There's actually, they have priorities. They're first giving it to the elderly people who are at risk. Of course, it's better for them. Thank God I don't fall into that category. So we'll just wait on it. But I'm also quite familiar with, I have quite a few friends who are vocal opponents of the vaccination, if only for political reasons, because they don't like anything that's forced on them by the government. And once again, so we'll stay clear of that. I just hope that everybody's staying safe. I was also wondering about all these people who don't go to work anymore. Once they realized that, hey, we don't have to go into work what's going to be with work when things go back to, I hope, go back to normal? Will we even have this anymore? So
it's up. Who knows? Who knows? I think people appreciate much. We were talking, as our family gathers around the dinner table. We each have, my wife has almost 2 hours extra every day of non-commuting. Even though my work is only 20-25 minutes from the house, by the time you park and walk to the car and get stuck in traffic, that's almost an hour a day of commuting. So it's been good to get that extra time. There's a lot you can do with that extra time.
I feel that also. I haven't been on buses to Jerusalem in a really long time, or on a regular basis, and I'm actually quite happy about it. Right. One of the things that I have to tell our audience, I discovered Dr. Brown's blog, Talmudology, just this year. I don't know how long it's been around for, although I was looking back in its archives because I had to catch up on it. So I read quite a lot of it. Talmudology is a series of posts that it's almost in tune with the Daf Yomi. That is, Dr. Brown tries to put it out, a particular topic, if that's what they happen to be studying around then. In Daf Yomi, we were on page 46 or 47, depending on what time zone you're in, because here it's already night. And one of the most interesting things that we've had recently is the science of chametz. And Dr. Brown I don't know if he wrote about this one particularly, but just last week he was talking about how chametz actually happens, why leavening is a function of certain grains and not other types of grains. That whole deal with what do you call it, oats. It's been quite a topic in the 20th century, that it turns out oats aren't exactly like the other grains, even though classically speaking, Rashi identifies oats as one of the 5 Talmudic grains that can become chametz. Just today, they were talking about how long it takes something to rise. Dr. Brown, have you seen the recent research by Rabbi Buch, Yoshua Buch, and others that are basically saying that they looked on the daf and they said, you mix flour and water together and it doesn't rise so fast. It actually takes more than an hour before any discernible leavening takes place. Have you seen his research about that?
I've not seen that specifically, but a lot of this is going to depend on where you live and the conditions that you are doing your experiments in. And we were talking just a moment ago about the extra time. So with some of the extra time that I've had, I've done something that is somewhat cliche now, but I've actually turned to bread baking. And I've become quite good at it, actually, and it's a pleasure to do it. And one of the things that I have learned, although every master baker knows this, is that it all depends on the initial conditions. And you can cook the same ingredients sometimes within a few minutes of each other, and 2 batches will come out quite differently. So, when we talk about things rising in a certain way, the question is, what do you mean by rising? What were your initial conditions? How hot was the water that you were using? Where were you located? Because when you don't add yeast, dough will rise automatically, by itself, and that's because there is yeast in the atmosphere. Now, of course, what yeast you happen to have around you is going to depend on where you live. So these initial conditions are all going to very much affect that final outcome of the leavening of the bread, of the rising of the dough. So we have to be very careful about what we're talking about if we're going to do this scientifically.
Really, you just surprised me. I figured the yeast that's in the air it's a natural component of the air, obviously, and that's what is introduced into the flour and the water when you start mixing it. I'm very surprised to hear that there's different yeasts in different air. Trying to say that
there's different yeast. Ask any baker. Go ask any baker. They will tell you, for instance, sourdough, which is a concoction that bread makers have at their disposal. These things are carefully nurtured. In fact, according to one expert, there were actually sourdough hotels in Switzerland. So because once you start these mixtures, you have to feed them flour and water every few days to keep the yeast cells alive. And what would happen when the owner went away? They would put them in a hotel where they would be fed. But anyway, these yeast mixtures are very carefully looked after by their owners because they impart flavor, specific flavor, depending on the yeasts that you and the flours that you're feeding the yeast. So yes, there's a lot of science and a lot of interesting artistry in this that comes out in the final bread or matzah that you're preparing.
Now, Talmudology really delights me because it doesn't allow any topic that is remotely related to science in the Gemara to go unattended or not given the proper attention that it needs. The Pesachim, the tractate, actually also has one of the more important discussions that affects us every week, how long it takes for the stars to come out. And even though that's another 50 or so pages away from our current topic of study, it's going to be another 50 days before we get to there. Well, we're going to be like 50 days from now. I guess it will be around the beginning of Adar or so. And there we also have an amazing discussion, how long it takes the stars to come out after sundown. And as some of our readers know, that's an issue every night. You have to know when the stars come out because that's when you're supposed to say Kriyat Shema. That's also the time when the Sabbath comes to an end. And there's a big issue there. I know, have you prepared an essay about this already? Rabbeinu Tam basically held, just like the Gemara says here, the stars only come out basically the time it takes a person to walk 4 ancient Roman miles from sunset. And the Vilna Gaon says, classically, it actually takes a lot shorter. It takes not even a quarter of that time to happen. And that's how he actually rules. What do you have to say about that, if I could surprise you with that question?
Sure. Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's something that I have actually written about it in Talmudology, the question of different kinds of twilight, because that's really what we're talking about here. We can see when the sun is no longer here, when it's dipped below the horizon, we have a great view of the night sky. But what is that period that you're talking about, where Rabbeinu Tam weighs in, Vilna Gaon, and many others? How low below the horizon does the sun have to be in order for us to see the stars? And there are actually at least 3 different kinds of twilight that we talk about astronomically. We talk about civil twilight, we talk about nautical twilight, and we talk about astronomical twilight. And these 3 are really just ways of describing how deep below the horizon the sun has set. And if people look in their calendars to look at their halachic times, it will. There's usually an indication as to what set of values the compiler of these halachic times is using in terms of how many degrees below the horizon the sun has set. So that's really what this is all about. Now, again, the way that we see the world and the sky today is very, very different from that which our ancestors saw. There is no doubt that the skies were far clearer without certainly the pollution and, of course, the light pollution that we have today. And so you were able to see things quite differently, even 100 years ago, compared to what we can see today.
Now, when I see Talmudology, I'm wondering, how did you have the time to put this together? When did you start? What prompted you to do that? I know I have a blog, but and I have my reasons for writing it. How'd you get to on this, and how'd you find the time, and where'd you start with this?
Well, it already began with Daf Yomi. I, together with my wife Erica, we undertook to start the Daf Yomi cycle in 2012, and we completed it almost exactly a year ago, right? In January 2020, we were very, very fortunate to be.
Corona is already,
Well, it was just a year ago, a year and a few days ago, that we attended the Siyam Hashas in Yerushalayim. We actually attended the Women's Siyam Hashas in Yerushalayim. My wife spoke there, which was actually, without doubt, one of the most religiously meaningful events, certainly of my life. And I'm just delighted that I was able to witness that. But it began with myself really studying Daf Yomi, and a couple of years into the Daf Yomi cycle, it was around 2014 actually, so two and a half years into Daf Yomi, I realized that there was a lot of science that was being discussed, not on every daf by any means, but many dafim, science, medicine, and geography. I have a great interest in those topics, and I just decided that it was time to write about them. And so I started, actually, my first post was back in November of 2014. It was in the middle of the Maseches Yevamos. It was on Yevamos Daf Mem Beis, the Yevamos 42, and it was talking about the age at which a baby is born and whether it's viable or not. There was an ancient tradition that's reflected also in the Talmud that a baby born at 8 months will not survive, but a baby that's born either complete gestation at 9 months, or more interestingly at 7 months, those will survive, not a baby born at 8 months. And I jumped right in there at Yevamos 42, sent it out to a few friends, and about 250 posts later, here we are. So in another year and a half or so, we will have completed the entire Shas. In other words, I'll have returned to Yevamos, and with it, I hope to have completed Talmudology on almost every topic of science that we've encountered. There are many that I will not have addressed. I have a list of those, and I hope to get to them. Sometimes I have to choose one of several on a daf, but it will be an event that I'm very much looking forward to, a personal siyum, if you like.
Okay. Dr. Brown has just mentioned in passing his wife, Dr. Erica Brown, the Jewish lecturer and educator in the greater Baltimore area, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Yeah, Washington, greater Washington area.
Greater Washington. Okay. So that's kind of amazing. I should have some study session with my wife. I wish we could say that we've come close to doing anything like completing Shas together as a couple, but God willing, we'll get around to it one day. What do you say to those who would claim that Ghazal had advanced scientific knowledge of things even beyond that which we can even comprehend or we haven't even imagined today? I've seen that claim before. What do you think of that?
Well, I've yet to see any evidence for that. I've yet to see any evidence for that. It's an extraordinary claim, and as we like to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if there's evidence of that, I'd like to see it. In fact, from my 6 years of studying science in the daf, I've actually come to the quite opposite conclusion, not one that I had thought I would come to, but it evolved naturally, and I think that's the right way to approach a text, is just to see what it teaches you. And that is that the statements about science in the Talmud and in the Medrash are absolutely almost entirely statements that are echoed by the Greeks, by the Romans, by popular culture at the time. There is nothing particularly Jewish about any of the statements that are uttered. In fact, if we can even call them science at all, and that's another discussion that we might want to get into, what makes something a scientific statement. But when Ghazal say something about the way that the universe works, whether the way that the sun revolves around the earth, whether or not bloodletting should be done on a certain day, they're really reflecting the generally accepted notions at the time. And there is nothing, as I said, particularly Jewish about nearly all of the statements that they make. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't, that they were all wrong. Many of them were actually very pleasantly correct. But I've yet to see any evidence that there was some secret that Ghazal knew about and would just not share it with anybody.
So you would also disagree with the proposition that Ghazal could not make a mistake or utter anything that was not scientifically true?
Well, I think there are many examples. I certainly don't. It's not my job to call Ghazal out, but when they say something that is patently not the case, then I will mention that, and that often is the case, and that's again not surprising, because when we think about the kind of world that we live in, Ghazal, like everybody else, did not have the tools, the understanding, and the experimental method that we so much take for granted. The way that you understood the world for 1,500 years was 2,000 years was through the Bible. And if the Bible taught you something, or you thought that it taught you something, that is how you claimed that is how you came to to what we would call a scientific understanding of it. And that's not, of course, the way that we do science today.
Okay. Dr. Shapiro came on this program a few weeks ago. Dr. Mark Shapiro. He's not a medical doctor. He's a professor of Jewish history and other amazing things. And he suggested that, based on his study of the Talmud, that Talmud was not meant for the layman. It wasn't meant for the masses to study. It was meant for people in the rabbinic judges to study. And that's why there's so many difficult statements there that perhaps people see that they don't understand what's going on there, or it seems almost politically incorrect, type of things that perhaps the people shouldn't be reading. What do you think of that assessment?
Well, it's an interesting observation, and Mark, of course, is an expert historian. But I'm not sure that when we say is not meant for the rabbinate, anyone other than the rabbinate, of course, that was probably historically true. Most people did not spend days and days, hours and hours a day studying Talmud. They had to go out and farm for a living, or they would die. The suggestion that the Talmud was studied in any kind of the way that we do it today is just simply wrong. And probably it was indeed entirely, as you're suggesting, Mark said, entirely the elites, the people who did not have to work for a living to put food on their table, who were able to study the Talmud. But it's an interesting question as to how we should be studying this document. I've always thought that the way that we teach it in high school, which is just incredibly challenging, to get 11, 12, 13-year-old kids, 15-year-old kids to become interested in this. When it's taught Kaseda, you start at page 1 or page 2 and you go all the way through. To me, it was always much more interesting, I think, to teach topics that we find in it. I think that's naturally a much more engaging way to study the Talmud, if only for the very reason that, as we know, the Talmud has a problem with attention. It has a very poor attention span, and gets veered off track so quickly that when you as a student are trying to study and say, hang on a second, why are we going down this path that can take us many lines or many pages? Why don't we just stick to what we're trying to figure out? You just have to get used to that. And so I think studying Talmud Kaseda, starting at the beginning of a masechet, of a tractate, and going all the way through, while of course that's the way to cover the most material, and to get this wonderful bird's eye view of the Talmud, which is what we get in Daf Yomi, it's not a very good way to teach children.
I feel that. I'm just about to finish Bava Basra. I started Bava Basra quite a while ago. I mean, I'm trying to keep up with the Daf, but also just because I haven't finished Bava Basra, and that's the longest tractate, I think it's the most meandering one also. I think every single topic that could possibly be in the Talmud figures in there somewhere, and I feel that. And especially this last parakah, they say, why is get Pasha at the end of Bava Basra? That's the laws of how to write Gittin and other documents. It's just the proper place to do. Perhaps it could have belonged in Gittin somewhere else, but that's how Ghazal had it. And then I was told by someone, try studying Yerushalmi. And Yerushalmi gets a lot less attention. It doesn't meander as much, and that's why the tractates are shorter. There's less pul. There's also less in there. The major claim made by Rishonim is that the Talmud Bavli takes into account the entire Yerushalmi. So it already has everything there, and it has to have even more because there's more discussion. I have a question here. What were your favorite topics to study for Talmudology? Maybe I missed something, or what do you think? Someone who's just introduced now, what should he know about?
What should you know about?
What I missed?
Wow. Well, I was actually just looking back at Bava Basra as you were talking about it. I don't know if you've had a chance, but Bava Basra, we talked about everything from King Herod's proclivity to use honey as a medical preservative. When his wife died, he covered her body with honey, and then we actually spent some time looking into the science of honey as a preservative. We spoke about the relationship between prophecy and mental illness. That comes up in the Gemara and Bava Basra and Daf Yud Beis on page 12. We spoke about the anatomy that wasn't there. That's a discussion of gynecological issues. The rabbis seem to have invented a bit of anatomy. And there's a wonderful Chasam Sofer where he says that there's this anatomy does not exist in reality, and don't worry about it. Talking about could Ghazal have made a mistake? There's the Chasam Sofer himself saying, yes, this is completely in error. There is no such thing, and let's move on. We spoke about the roots of a palm tree. We spoke about where heaven and earth meet. We spoke about the color of the sun. It's a question that here hinges on the location of the Garden of Eden, and we contrasted the Talmudic understanding of why the sun is red compared that with, of course, the modern scientific explanations. We also mentioned the healing power of saliva. The Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Yud Beis, actually said, Daf Kuf Kaf Vav 126, says that the saliva of a firstborn can heal, and we looked at that idea in antiquity. And an interesting topic that we spoke about when we came to Baba Basra 155 was delayed puberty in boys. Actually, this is very interesting because we spoke about when Ghazal got it wrong. Here's an example where, as far as I could tell, Ghazal were way ahead. Rabbi Chia says that certain children can have delayed onset of puberty, and this was not really fully understood until until much more recently. The effects of what we eat on the onset of puberty. So there's an example, if you like, of Ghazal talking about something that we're only just understanding. So Reb Chia said that there was an association between obesity and delayed puberty in boys, and this, of course, wasn't reported until much later, in the last 20 or 30 years or so. So what's my favorite topic? It's usually the one I've just most recently written about, but there's a wealth of stuff to talk about.
Wait, what was recently about the chametz thing? That's your favorite topic?
No, I'm saying it's usually my most recent one because I'd spent the most time talking about it. I've been doing some reposts as well. Obviously, many topics are repeated in the Talmud, and so they might be. I might repost some stuff. I think if you want to get an interesting idea, though, of the relationship between what we call rabbinic philosophy and the scientific method, was a series of posts I did back in January of 2015 on the different. It was actually it actually began looking at an interesting scientific dispute about. And indeed a legal dispute about in Victorian England about whether a man could marry his dead wife's sister. It's not Yibum, it's the reverse of Yibum. In Yibum, a man marries his dead brother's wife. This is a debate talking about whether a man could marry his dead wife's sister. Anyway, this stimulated a discussion in on Talmudology about rabbinic philosophy and the scientific method, and how it is that we don't get worried when science progresses, but unfortunately, this wasn't understood by many rabbinic thinkers who weighed in on what they thought science was.
Mm-hmm. So I had something that happens quite often, even happened to me today. I study Talmud or teaching Talmud to anybody who's just even young teenagers to adults, and you always encounter something where, let's say the Talmud would say something that they cannot accept, like that's not what I know, and therefore they lose respect possibly, or we have to actually show them, well, if you would close the Talmud and you'd go to the Talmudology blog or look into the writings of Rav Herzog and etc., you'd find that there's actually an explanation for this and it's not so bad, etc. Have you ever been brought into conflict with any study partners, not your wife, or anybody, let's say people in the rabbinate who felt that perhaps we shouldn't be so maskilish. We shouldn't try to bring so much of this science into the Talmud and just take Ghazal for what they said, and it should definitely not affect halachic practice. What do you think of that?
So I've not been called out on it. I don't think my work is important enough to have to have bothered people in the rabbinate who are bothered by such things. But I have seen an overwhelming amount of support in the emails that I get, and of course in the readership. Something like over 55,000 people read Talmudology at one time or another last year. That's a lot of people who are interested in science and the Talmud. And I think, coming to your question about when somebody comes across something they can't understand. Look, let's go back to that question of the 8-month fetus cannot survive. So Ghazal say several places, Yevamos and many other places, that a child that is born prematurely at 8 months will not survive, but if it's born prematurely at 7 months, it will survive. And of course, at 9 months, it will survive. Now, of course, on the face of this is preposterous. Why would an infant that is more gestationally complete, i.e. 8 months, be less likely to survive than a child born a month earlier at 7 months. It makes no medical sense whatsoever, and of course it's completely wrong. Now, if you're trying to teach a student that and they throw their hands up and they say, oh, this is ridiculous, and why am I studying this? This is nonsense. The way I think to address that is to say, you know what? Let's see what everybody else thought at the time. So you go back and you look, and you turn out that this is a very well-established principle in Greek thought. And not only that, but in 1600 and in 1700, and I bring examples on my blog, there were textbooks that said exactly this, that a child born at 7 months will survive, a child born at 8 months will not. So here we are, about 1200 years, a century, a millennia and a half after the closing of the Talmud. And this is what doctors thought in England in 1600 and 1700. So you turn to your student and you say, you see, this isn't a crazy thought. Ghazal were reflecting what everybody thought. They'd have been wrong. They'd have been crazy to have thought anything else. So what they're reflecting here is a general belief, and it happens to be that your students, just like I had, and many others reading the Talmud, came across this idea for the first time, not because they came at it through medicine, but they came at it through the Talmud. Now, to me, the correct reply, the interesting reply, not the correct one, but an interesting reply is to put it into historic context and to explain that this is what everybody thought. Now, of course, you then come to two further sort of bifurcations. If this is what everybody thought and they were wrong, why am I following or listening to what Ghazal said about other things? And that's a question that I think is a very reasonable question and does need to be addressed. But I think this idea that, oh, well, there's a secret here that Ghazal were getting at, that if only we understood it, would make sense to us, it's a silly path to go down, quite frankly. Put it into context, understand that what everybody was thinking, and then you see that Ghazal were like all the other scientists of the day, if we can call them that, all the other thinkers of the day, in expecting an 8-month baby not to survive, but a baby born at 7 months to survive. Everybody thought that all the way until the 1700s.
So now that you've looked into this issue, maybe we could just give me a little bit of an answer why it is that mankind thought this for so long. Yeah.
So it's look, it's not exactly clear. It all begins. I mean, not just because there were thinkers about it. It all, doesn't mean that that it makes sense. I mean, it goes all the way back, in fact, to let me just remind myself. Hippocrates, who writes that. So he's writing now in the 5th century BC, right? 500 years. That's 700 years before the closing of the Mishnah, right? So 500 BC, and he writes that women who are born at 8 months are unlikely to survive, and indeed this now has halachic ramifications. The Rambam, for example, rules that if a baby is born on the 8th month of gestation and his bris falls out on a Shabbos, it's postponed until Sunday because that baby is considered to be as good as dead, and so you can't be Chal Shabbos for the bris for that baby. So this, I can't tell you why they thought this, but I can tell you that it was a well-established principle all the way back. In fact, in the Iliad, which is written sometime around the 8th century BC, so that's really old. Homer's Iliad records that a 7-month fetus can survive. So this is a very old belief, and it's not surprising, therefore, that it made its way into Ghazal. Now, then what happens when you have somebody who says, okay, fine, I get it. Ghazal, like everybody else, believed that an 8-month baby will not survive, but a 7-month baby will. But that's not true. So what about the halacha now of a baby born at 8 months? Do we have his bris on a Shabbat? The Rambam ruled that we don't. So that's where I think you start to get into these interesting questions about how we should change, or if we should change halachic practice that is based on misguided science. We actually just had this fairly recently. I looked into how the hot springs of Tiberia are heated. That came up in Daf Yomi just last week, and it turns out that there was a belief. Ghazal believed that the hot springs of Tiberia were heated by the sun as the sun passes underneath the earth at night. It sort of heats them up from the bottom, like a stove heats up a pot of hot water. Of course, that's not correct. They're heated geothermally. And this raises the question, well, Ghazal therefore say that if you cook a chicken in the hot springs of Tiberia, there's no biblical, you haven't transgressed the biblical prohibition of cooking because that requires a fire. Well, and this comes this comes from the sun. It's a tolda of Shemesh, if we're going to be halachic about it. And therefore, strictly speaking, there's no biblical prohibition against doing that. Or, of course, there is a rabbinic prohibition. But what happens if that's incorrect and it turns out that actually it is heated by fire, by volcanoes deep in the ground? Could it therefore turn out to be that not only are you what once was not biblically prohibited to cook in these hot springs is indeed biblically prohibited, because now we understand the science a little bit better. That's just one little example of how these questions actually percolate up. It's not a very important question. There are far more important questions than that. But it's an example of how, when the science is better understood, we, of course, can come back and question about what we should do with the halakha. And, of course, I think those of us who are committed to Jewish tradition understand that it's not the way that things work, that once we have a rule on the books, it's very, very hard to take it off.
So let me go back to the Parsha, because we're winding down now. You could perhaps clarify something that's bothered me for a long time. There's a classic midrash that shortly before God finally appeared to Moses and said, okay, time to rescue my people, things got really bad. And it says in the text that the Israelites cried out to God because they're suffering. It says a king of Egypt had died at that point. There was a change in regime. And Ghazal say that the Pharaoh at the time didn't actually die. Why is it remarkable that it says he died? Because he became a leper, and he discovered that in order to treat whatever he was suffering from, he needed to bathe in blood. And this is quite horrific, and it says that he decided to reinstitute the old policies from a few decades ago, killing Jewish babies in order to obtain the blood for bathing. Now, that's kind of horrific. Obviously, it doesn't say that in the text. With every medrash, we have to know that some of them are just not historical. And Ghazal themselves said it. They argue about when Balaam died. Was he a few hundred years old or 35 years old? There cannot be, you can't resolve historical stories in the Midrash. So what I do want to ask myself is why, even if it were the case, why would anybody, Pharaoh or Ghazal, believe that bathing in blood is a cure for leprosy or similar whatever skin diseases that people had back in the day?
That's a fascinating question, and it's not one that I've looked into, but you could certainly, I mean, there are two things that we have to think about here. Number one, is it historically true that that's what happened? That's a sort of an interesting historical question. But I think the deeper question that you're asking here is, why would Ghazal have thought that would happen and produce this medrash? I always remember the late Rabbi, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat HaKotel, used to describe the Torah as the visual and the medrash as the sound, as the soundtrack to the visuals. And I thought that was a very particularly beautiful way of thinking about what medrash does to the visual text of the Torah. Why would the rabbis have come up with this idea? And again, one thing we haven't talked about, Avi, is this question of the rabbis. This is, like most things in the Talmud, there's a statement of one particular rabbi that we talk about the Talmud saying. So why would whoever was the author of this and other statements, why would they have said that? What was it about their perception of slavitude in Egypt that may have led them to say this? And I think, even just hearing about this, for a couple of minutes, you don't have to think very deeply. The slavitude in England was so profound. The slavitude in Egypt, not in England. The slavitude in Egypt was so profound that the leader of that kingdom his existence was predicated on the life force of the Jewish people, of the nascent Jewish people that were there, and that every moment that they were there, their lifeblood was literally being sucked out of them in some way, if not through Pharaoh bathing in their blood, then certainly through the slaves and their lifestyle that was probably as close to death as one could come without actually dying. So to me, this idea of Pharaoh bathing in blood is a suggestion that the slavitude was such a dire, profound kind that it sucked the very life force, the lifeblood out of everybody. And that, of course, is well known. Blood was, of course, considered the life force. Gemara in Chulin mentioned it many, many times that the blood is the life force of an animal. And it's no doubt in my mind, therefore, that thinking about the visual of a pharaoh bathing in the blood of his subjects, of his slaves, is a very powerful one, and probably really expresses what slavery was all about in a much more graphic way than words could simply, than the Torah's words alone.
Okay, so I thought that perhaps you'd get to think that perhaps the Greeks at the time in the let's say the 5 centuries before the Common Era believed that actually fresh blood is sort of a skin treatment. I hope that such a thing never was actually believed by anybody.
I hope so too. Well, who knows? Maybe we'll come across it.
Oh no, I hope not. It's terrible thinking the way people before the modern era, especially non-Jewish societies, sometimes the lack of concern for life, or the lack of respect for everybody. You could kill your slave if you wanted to. I think there was Roman laws about this also, about just like how a patron, someone who was a free man, could actually put to death any of his descendants if you so choose. And other things, the status of women in societies, as we also know, there was a lot that thank God has improved since then. Dr. Jeremy Brown, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much for keeping up the posts on Talmudology. It's very good for me. I can't go if there's a morning when I discover when I can't eat breakfast before I've actually read it through and thought about it for a while. So it's been very good for me. Don't forget to check it out. Talmudology. Is it just Talmudology?
Talmudology.com. Easy to find.
Okay. And you can find there, and I think you have a website also, your own personal website. You can find Dr. Brown's professional repertoire there, and other things. I hope that God willing, we see an end to the socio-political unrest, both here and in countries in the West, and also we should speedily get to the end of this epidemic or pandemic. You could tell me what's the right word to use. People say pandemic. I was wondering, epidemic, pandemic, what's the difference? But perhaps that's for next time. God willing, we should get over this. And don't forget to send in your questions and comments, like, share, and subscribe. And tune in next week. We have another special guest. And thank you for joining us. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you.